If you've ever wondered what it feels like to stand inside the most feared prison in American history, staring into the eyes of a man who once owned an entire city, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe, hit that bell, and don't you dare look away, because this story gets darker with every single minute. The cold was the first thing people noticed about Alcatraz. Not the isolation. Not the concrete walls soaked with decades of misery. Not even the distant shimmer of San Francisco's lights, taunting every man on that island with a freedom they could see but never touch. No, it was the cold, a damp, bone-grinding chill that crawled up from the bay and settled permanently inside your chest, like something alive that had decided to stay. It was January 1934, and Federal Penitentiary No. 1, Alcatraz Island, had just received its most famous resident, Alphonse Gabriel Capone, inmate number 85. The guards had been briefed. The warden had issued a direct order. No special treatment. No exceptions. No acknowledgement that this man had once commanded an empire stretching from the south side of Chicago to the darkest corners of Washington, D.C. To the federal government, Al Capone was simply a convicted tax evader serving an 11-year sentence. To everyone else on that island, guards, inmates, and the whispers that echoed through the cell block at night, he was something else entirely. He was a legend walking into a cage. When the prison ferry docked at the island's loading dock that bitter January morning, Capone stepped onto the concrete pier wearing a tailored suit that looked grotesquely out of place against the gray stone walls and gray sky. He was 34 years old, thick-shouldered, his face round and scarred, 2 jagged lines running down his left cheek, souvenirs from a knife fight in a Brooklyn bar when he was barely 19. He scanned the island slowly, the way a man surveys a new property he's about to purchase, not a prison he's about to endure. One of the younger guards, a 26-year-old named Thomas Reardon, watched from the intake corridor as Capone was processed. He later told his wife in a letter that he had met dangerous men before. Murderers, robbers, men with nothing left to lose. But he had never felt what he felt that morning. It wasn't fear exactly, Reardon wrote. It was like standing next to a storm that hadn't decided yet whether to break. Capone was assigned to Cellblock D, the psychiatric observation unit. Not because he was unstable, at least not in the traditional sense, but because Warden James Johnston had made a calculated decision. Keep Capone isolated. Keep him from becoming a power center. In every prison Capone had passed through before Alcatraz, he had managed, within weeks, to create an informal hierarchy with himself quietly at the top. Favors exchanged. Alliances built. Cigarettes, kitchen privileges, protection. Capone operated like nature itself. He didn't force the ecosystem. He simply became the center of it. Johnston was determined that would not happen here. For the first 6 weeks it seemed to be working. Capone followed the rules with an unsettling precision. He ate his meals without complaint. He attended his work assignments in the laundry and later the shoe repair shop without incident. He was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The guards who had braced themselves for outbursts, demands, the arrogance of a man used to getting what he wanted, got none of it. Senior guard Franklin Bowles, a 15-year veteran who had worked in 3 federal facilities, told his supervisor something that got quietly buried in an internal memo. Capone isn't adjusting, Bowles wrote. He's studying. Nobody paid much attention to that memo at the time. Then, on March 3, 1934, 47 days into Capone's sentence, an inmate named Lucas Webb was found unconscious in the shower block of Cellblock B. His jaw was broken in 2 places. 3 ribs were fractured. He had been beaten with something hard and precise, not the frantic violence of a brawl, but the measured, deliberate work of someone who wanted to send a message without sending a body to the morgue. Webb survived, but he refused to identify his attacker. He sat in the medical ward for 11 days, staring at the wall, barely speaking, eating only when the nurse physically placed food in front of him. When investigators pressed him, his answer was always the same, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. I slipped. No witnesses came forward. The block cameras, primitive in 1934, covered only the entry corridor, Whoever had done this knew exactly where the blind spots were. Within 72 hours, something had shifted in Cellblock D. The other inmates moved differently around Capone's cell. Quieter, more deferential, small things. A slightly longer pause before passing his doorway. An averted gaze. The invisible grammar of prison politics being rewritten in real time. Warden Johnston called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. He laid out what they knew, which was almost nothing, and what he suspected, which was everything. "Capone isn't behind bars," Johnston reportedly said, pressing both fists flat against the conference table. "Capone is building a new Chicago. And we just handed him the blueprints." But as Johnston's staff scrambled to tighten protocols, rearrange work assignments, and increase surveillance rotations, none of them had seen what guard Thomas Reardon had noticed that same evening while doing his final rounds. Capone's cell was immaculate. Bible open on the small desk. Hands folded. Eyes closed as though in prayer. And on the underside of the wooden desk shelf, carved into the grain with something impossibly small and sharp, barely visible unless the light hit it at a precise angle, were 3 letters. R. H. B. Reardon didn't know what they meant. He wrote them down, folded the paper, and slipped it into his breast pocket, deciding to ask about it in the morning. He never got the chance. Because when the 5 a.m. shift change came around the next day, Thomas Reardon did not show up for his post. His coat was hanging in the guard locker room. His timesheet was signed in. His coffee was sitting on the break room table, still warm. But Thomas Reardon was gone. And when investigators finally traced those 3 carved letters, R.H.B., through prison records, back-channel informants, and a retired Chicago detective who went pale when he heard them spoken aloud, what they uncovered wasn't just a prison conspiracy. It was the beginning of the most dangerous secret Al Capone had ever kept. Chapter 2 drops next. If you think you know where this is going, you don't. Hit subscribe and come back, because the truth about what happened inside Alcatraz in 1934 is something they never taught you in school. There are moments in a criminal investigation when the evidence stops pointing toward a suspect and starts pointing back at the investigators themselves. Moments when the people asking the questions realize, with a cold and creeping dread, that they may have been inside the story all along. This was one of those moments. Thomas Reardon's disappearance hit the Alcatraz administration like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were immediate and they spread fast. Warden Johnston ordered a full lockdown within the hour. Every cell inspected. Every inmate accounted for. Every inch of the island swept by guards who moved through the fog with flashlights and clenched jaws, because Alcatraz was supposed to be the place things could not escape from. People were not supposed to vanish here. People were supposed to be found. The search lasted 11 hours. They checked the rocky shoreline below the western wall, the maintenance tunnels beneath the kitchen block, the utility corridors that ran like veins through the oldest part of the building. They found nothing. No body. No blood. No signs of struggle. Just the ghost of a man who had been standing in a break room with a warm cup of coffee and then, without explanation, was not. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was notified by nightfall. Special Agent Daniel Harker arrived on the island 2 days later. He was 41, lean, with the kind of tired eyes that come not from lack of sleep but from having seen too much of what people are capable of doing to each other. He had worked organized crime cases for 9 years. He had put men away in Chicago, in New York, in Detroit. He knew the architecture of how criminal networks operated, how they communicated, how they punished, and how they protected their interests across impossible distances. When Harker stepped off the ferry and looked up at the cell blocks rising from the rock, his first question was not about Reardon. His first question was about the letters. R.H.B., he said to Johnston, standing in the warden's office with a carved piece of shelf wood sitting on the desk between them. How long before someone thought to run these through Chicago records? Johnston said nothing. Harker already knew the answer. Nobody had. 'Cause nobody had wanted to. He spent the first day reviewing every interaction Capone had logged since his arrival. Every work assignment, every meal, every visitor request, all of which had been denied, every piece of outgoing mail, which was reviewed and approved before being sent. On the surface, it was the record of a man doing exactly what he was told. But Harker had spent enough years studying men like Capone to know that the surface was never the story. The surface was the performance. He began pulling the approved outgoing mail, 43 letters over 47 days, all addressed to Capone's wife May in Miami. Routine correspondence. Affectionate in places, mundane in others. The kind of letters a homesick man writes when he has nothing left but time. The prison censor had cleared every single one without flagging a word. Harker read them again. Then he read them a third time. And it was on that third pass, reading slowly, aloud, one sentence at a time, that he stopped at a paragraph in the 7th letter. Capone had written, "Tell Rose to water the begonias on the back step. She always forgets the ones hiding behind the post." Harker set the letter down. He picked up a pen and circled 4 words. Rose, hiding, behind, post, R, H, B, P. The 4th letter had been trimmed, carved into the shelf with only 3 initials because the 4th one wasn't meant for the wall. It was meant for whoever read it next. And in a moment that made Harker's stomach drop with a slow, nauseating certainty, he understood what Thomas Reardon had been. Not a target. Not an innocent bystander caught in the wrong corridor at the wrong time. Reardon had been a courier. Harker moved fast. He contacted the FBI field office in Miami within the hour, requesting immediate surveillance on May Capone's residence, and in particular any contact involving a woman named Rose. The response came back the following morning, and it hit Harker like a fist to the sternum. There was no Rose connected to the Capone household. But there was a man. A former Capone lieutenant named Richard Harold Baines, known in Chicago as Rose, because of a rose tattoo running up the left side of his neck, a man who had quietly vanished from Chicago's criminal landscape in late 1933, 6 months before Capone ever arrived at Alcatraz. Baines was supposed to be dead. 3 separate FBI informants had confirmed his death. A warehouse fire on the south side, ruled accidental, 2 bodies found burned beyond identification, one of which the Chicago field office had attributed to Baines based on circumstantial evidence, and a watch recovered from the scene. But the watch, Harker now realized, looking at the evidence photographs with fresh eyes and a rising sense of something close to controlled panic, the watch had no serial number. It had been stripped clean. And the identification had been made by a single source, a Chicago beat officer named Patrick Mullen, who had retired suddenly and very quietly 8 months later. Harker stood at the window of the warden's office and looked out at the bay. The fog had come in thick again, swallowing the lights of the city until San Francisco was nothing but a faint orange glow at the edge of the world. Capone had known he was going to Alcatraz months before he arrived. He had used those months to build something, a chain, invisible and patient, stretching from a federal prison island to the mainland, held together by letters about begonias and missing couriers and a dead man who apparently wasn't dead at all. And Thomas Reardon, the young guard who had copied down 3 letters on a folded piece of paper and planned to ask about them in the morning, had been the weak link that Capone's people had quietly, efficiently removed. Harker requested a direct interview with Capone. Johnston warned him against it. "He'll tell you nothing," the warden said. "He never does." "I don't need him to tell me anything," Harker replied, straightening his jacket and picking up his file. "I need him to know that I know. Because if Baines is alive and moving, Capone will need to send a new message. And when he tries..." He let the sentence hang. The interview was scheduled for the following morning, in the gray, fluorescent-lit interrogation room off the main corridor of Cellblock D. Harker arrived early. He set up his notes. He waited. At precisely 8 a.m., 2 guards escorted Al Capone through the door. He sat down across from Harker without being asked, folded his hands on the table, and smiled, a slow, warm, completely terrifying smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes and wasn't meant to. "Special Agent Harker," Capone said. "I've been expecting you." Harker felt the skin on the back of his neck pull tight, because that sentence meant one of 2 things. Either Capone's network had already told him an FBI agent was on the island, which meant the breach ran deeper than anyone had calculated. Or it meant something worse. It meant there was someone else in that room who was already working for Capone. Harker glanced toward the door. Both guards were standing with their backs against the wall, faces neutral, hands clasped. One of them, the one on the left, was not looking at Capone. He was looking at Harker's open file on the table, reading it upside down. And his left hand, barely visible beneath the cuff of his uniform sleeve, carried a rose tattoo. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when every person in it realizes, at exactly the same moment, that the danger is not coming. The danger is already there, already seated, already breathing the same air, already 3 steps ahead of everyone who thought they were in control. That silence fell over Interrogation Room C of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary at 8:04 in the morning on March 19, 1934. And in that silence, Special Agent Daniel Harker made the only decision available to a man who has just realized he is completely alone in a room with the enemy. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the guard with the rose tattoo long enough to confirm what he already knew. Instead, he slowly closed his file folder, folded his hands on top of it, and looked directly at Al Capone with the steady, unreadable expression of a man who has decided to play the longest card at the table. "It's a cold morning," Harker said. Capone tilted his head slightly, the smile still sitting on his face like something painted there. "It's always cold here, Agent Harker. That's the point of the place." The interview lasted 22 minutes by the official record. It produced nothing of value, according to the transcript filed with the Bureau that afternoon. Capone answered every question with the polished, almost theatrical cooperation of a man who knows that cooperation, when deployed correctly, is its own kind of weapon. He expressed concern for the missing guard. He offered sympathies. He stated clearly and with apparent sincerity that he ran no operations from inside Alcatraz, that he was a changed man, that he hoped to one day return to his family in Miami and live out his remaining years in peace. He said all of this while the man with the rose tattoo stood 6 feet away. What the official transcript did not record was what happened in the final 30 seconds, after the session was formally closed, after Harker had stood and buttoned his jacket and the guards had moved to escort Capone back to his cell. As Capone passed Harker's chair, he paused just long enough to say, in a voice barely above a murmur, something that Harker would write down in his personal field notes that evening and circle 3 times. "Tell them the begonias are already planted." Harker walked out of that building and directly to the communications room, bypassing Johnston's office entirely. He sent 2 simultaneous encrypted wires to the Bureau. The first was a request for immediate extraction and protective custody of May Capone's household in Miami, on the grounds of potential evidence tampering. The second was a personal request directed to his supervisor in Washington, marked urgent, requesting the immediate suspension and detainment of every guard currently assigned to Cellblock D pending a full loyalty investigation. Then he sat down and did something that no procedure manual had ever suggested, and that his years of training had never quite prepared him for. He started drawing a map. Not a map of Alcatraz. Map of time. 12 months. Starting from the moment Capone's conviction had been handed down in October 1931, moving through every transfer, every administrative decision, every personnel appointment that had led to this precise configuration of people on this island. He tracked names, assignments, transfers requested and granted. Guard rotations changed at the last minute. A supply contractor who had won a federal bid 3 months before Capone's arrival, a contractor whose primary offices were in Chicago's South Side. By midnight, the map covered 4 pages of legal paper and Daniel Harker had not slept in 31 hours. By dawn, the FBI field office in Miami had made contact with a neighbor of May Capone, who reported that a man matching Richard Harold Baines's description had been seen entering the residence twice in the previous 2 weeks, always after dark, always leaving before sunrise. By 9 a.m., agents had the house under surveillance. By noon, Baines walked out the front door carrying a leather satchel. He made it 4 steps down the driveway. The arrest was quiet, efficient, and almost anticlimactic in the way that the resolution of a long and complicated lie so often is. Baines said nothing when the cuffs went on. He looked up at the sky for a moment, the way a man does when he knows the next sky he sees freely will be a very long time coming, and then he got into the back of the federal vehicle without resistance. The satchel contained $37,000 in cash, a coded ledger written in a shorthand that bureau cryptographers would spend the next 6 weeks untangling, and a one-way train ticket to Vancouver departing that same evening. It also contained something that nobody had anticipated. Something that shifted the entire investigation sideways and cracked it open in a direction that made even the most seasoned agents go quiet when they read the report. Inside a sealed envelope, tucked beneath the cash and the ledger, were 2 documents. The first was a signed affidavit, notarized, dated 18 months earlier, in which a senior official of the Federal Bureau of Prisons confirmed receiving a payment of $12,000 in exchange for ensuring that Al Capone's assignment to Alcatraz would be to Cellblock D, under a specific rotation of guards, 3 of whom Capone's organization had identified and cultivated over the previous year. The affidavit named the official. He was currently serving on the committee overseeing the expansion of the federal prison system. His office was in Washington. The second document was a list of 14 names: judges, prosecutors, 2 members of Congress, a Treasury Department auditor who had worked on the original tax evasion case. And at the very bottom of the list, added in different ink, as though written later and in a hurry, one final name. It was the name of the FBI agent who had originally recommended Harker for the Alcatraz assignment. Harker read the list in the back of a bureau car parked outside the Miami field office. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in his breast pocket, and sat for a long time watching the afternoon light move across the windshield. The case broke wide open over the following 3 months. 7 arrests. For convictions. The prison official resigned before charges were formally filed and was found dead in his home study 6 days later, ruled a suicide. A ruling that 3 separate investigators would quietly contest in internal memos that were never made public. Thomas Reardon was eventually located alive, living under a false name in a boarding house in New Orleans, too frightened to come forward, having been given a choice by Baines on that March morning: disappear or be disappeared. He testified before a federal grand jury in October and was placed under protective custody. Richard Harold Baines received a 22-year sentence. The guard with the rose tattoo, whose real name was Carl Metzger and who had been recruited by Capone's network before he had ever applied for the Alcatraz position, received 18 years. Al Capone remained in Alcatraz. He never faced additional charges for the conspiracy. The evidence against him personally was circumstantial: a carved initial, a letter about begonias, a smile in an interrogation room. Nothing that would hold in a federal court against a defense team that had already demonstrated its willingness to reach into the machinery of the justice system and quietly rearrange the parts. He served his full sentence, deteriorating steadily from the late-stage syphilis that had been eating at his nervous system for years, until he was released in 1939, a diminished version of the man who had walked off that ferry in January 1934. He retired to his estate in Palm Island, Florida, confused and largely incapacitated, dying on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48. The newspapers called it the end of an era. Daniel Harker, who attended no celebrations and gave no interviews, drove home to his apartment in Washington that evening, poured a glass of water, and stood at his kitchen window for a long time. He had brought down a piece of the machine, a corner of it. A single room in a structure that had more rooms than he would ever have years to find. He thought about the 14 names on the list. He had passed the list to his superiors. Most of the names had been investigated. Some had been charged. Several had not. He thought about the one at the bottom, added in different ink. That investigation had been quietly shelved. Insufficient evidence, he was told. The case was closed. He stood at the window and thought about what Capone had said in the interrogation room, in that last murmured sentence before he walked back to his cell. The begonias are already planted. Not were. Not have been. Or present tense. Harker set down his glass and walked to his desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. Because in 23 years of federal service he had learned one thing above all others, the thing that every true crime case eventually forces every honest investigator to confront. Locking up one man, even the most famous man in America, even the most feared man in a generation, does not dismantle what that man built. It does not uproot the network. It does not silence the people who were paid. It does not recover the favors that were owed. It only makes the empire invisible. And invisible empires, as Daniel Harker had just spent the most dangerous months of his career learning, are the only kind that never truly fall. They put America's most dangerous man in the most secure prison ever built. And from inside a 6-by-9-foot cell, he nearly ran the country. If this story shook you the way it should have, you are absolutely not ready for what comes next. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay close. Because the next case we're opening is darker, deeper, and even more real. Don't say we didn't warn you.